Every schoolchild in the English-speaking world learns William the Conqueror's name. What most of them never hear is that William spent his final years bitter about another Norman knight, a man his own contemporaries considered the more accomplished conqueror of their generation. His name was Robert Guiscard. He was born to a minor noble family in Normandy, with too many sons and too little land. He arrived in southern Italy as a bandit stealing horses in Calabria. 20 years later, he was Duke of Apulia and defeated the Byzantine Emperor in battle and was planning to march on Constantinople itself. When William landed in Hastings in 1066, Guiscard had already been ruling more Italian territory for 7 years than William would ever hold in England. And Guiscard wasn't alone. He was one of 12 brothers. Between them, the sons of a minor Norman lord named Tancred de Hauteville built something the English conquest never came close to matching. The standard story of the Norman conquest treats William as the main event. That story is incomplete. The Hautevilles took southern Italy from the Byzantines and the Lombards, conquered Sicily from the Arabs across a 30-year campaign, defeated Byzantine emperors in the field, plotted to seize Constantinople, and built what was arguably the most sophisticated multicultural state in medieval Europe. Their Kingdom of Sicily, declared in 1130 and ruled from Palermo, employed Muslim scholars in administration, Byzantine bureaucrats in treasury, and Latin monks in its chancery. It was more institutionally advanced than the Holy Roman Empire that it would eventually inherit. And the kingdom they built didn't end when the Norman blood ran out. It ran through Frederick II, legally a Hohenstaufen emperor, but raised in Palermo speaking Arabic, ruling a court his Hauteville mother had built, and whose German imperial titles he inherited almost by accident. It continued through the Angevins and the Aragonese and the Bourbons. From Robert Guiscard's ducal title in 1059 to Napoleon's dissolution of the kingdom in 1816, 725 years of continuous political existence in southern Italy, all built on the institutional architecture the Hautevilles laid down. The Norman house that William founded ended in 3 generations. The pattern worth tracing is the mercenary to monarch template. The Hautevilles didn't invade southern Italy. They were invited in, hired as sword arms by a fragmented power structure of Byzantines, Lombards, and papal claimants, each of whom needed muscle and none of whom could hold territory alone. Once inside, the Normans made themselves indispensable. They took the whole thing. By the end of this, you won't just understand why the English language remembers William and forgets Guiscard. You'll remember the mechanism, because the same template, offer yourself as an essential service to a fragmented authority, make yourself impossible to remove, and become the authority you were hired to defend against, is still running. And once you see it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Today I'm joined by Memory Medieval to walk through the Norman conquest that history didn't teach you. Welcome back to Hidden Forces in History. I am your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. And we have another interview this week as we're kind of going through this dynasties of the, ancient, medieval, and a bit into the modern world, as we're going to end up with the Pahlavis later in this bit of dynasties. And I'm excited for today's interview because today's guest I've actually interviewed for the Athenian Book Club podcast. And I've been trying to figure out, I love his X content so much. How do we figure out how to do something together? And I think this is really the perfect place for us to end up. We're going to be talking about the Italian Normans, which is extremely interesting. We've talked about the English Normans earlier, where we talked about William the Conqueror and that conquest. But today's episode, we might be talking about something even greater than William the Conqueror. So welcome to the show, Memory Medieval.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on. Very excited to talk about the Italian Normans. It's a particularly favorite subject of mine.
Yeah, and just, I guess, for our listeners and our viewers, I am operating totally off notes because after Rome falls, I know nothing until Garibaldi in the 19th century. So Michael's really going to really give us the details on things today. But for people that may not know you, may not have experienced you on this feed, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, man.
Yeah, well, I've got my Memory Medieval project. I guess, the whole goal is just to really revitalize an interest and enthusiasm in medieval history. So I have a podcast of my own where I interview some historians, some other enthusiasts and things like that. I recently started a digital publication that we're going to make into a physical publication by the end of the year for some more creative essays on medieval history, really just to give people sort of a unique look beyond sort of like academic or straight narrative look into history. So we got that coming, and really I love posting about history. I read a lot of history and just trying to really revitalize the enthusiasm in the history.
And you do an excellent job of it too. So if people aren't following you on X, they should definitely do so, as you're always putting out a lot of great knowledge. And I'll make an apology kind of before we get going here that if I mess up any of these pronunciations, I have looked them up. I've tried to make sure I remember the pronunciations, but I will do my best here since we have some French names, some Italian names, and a Hohenstaufen in here too. So it's going to be a bit interesting. But I want to start before the Normans arrived. I think this is a good place for us to start. So what did southern Italy actually look like? Because we had Byzantines, we had Lombards, Arabs, and the papacy, basically all fighting for pieces of what was left of the Western Roman Empire. So why couldn't any of them actually consolidate territory? And what made this the perfect vacuum for, here's one of these names, Hautevilles, the Hautevilles to actually exploit?
Yeah, well, I maybe I should apologize too. We're both Americans talking about European history, so that's.
Well, my viewers make fun of me big time, man. They're like, he should know pronunciations. He's a real historian. It's like, man, I am from the East Coast. I do my best here.
Yeah, East Coast even. Yeah, so. Yeah, so Italy, I mean, it's kind of hard to say because when Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire fractures up and splits into three parts, that's sort of the middle portion of it ends up sort of getting absorbed by the two other pieces, which end up becoming the Holy Roman Empire and France, or the Kingdom of the Franks. And so Italy just ends up becoming sort of this fractured place. It sort of gets a little bit invaded by the Muslims during the Arab conquests. The Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, they are sort of almost kind of continually in decline, and they have a lot of problems elsewhere for the most part. And Basil II, he was about to actually go and sort of reassert his authority in Italy and reconquer a lot of that, but he ended up dying the year that his expedition was sort of set to launch. And so that sort of created a very, that's actually a little bit after the Normans arrived, but there was never any real anybody who could really assert authority, whether it was, the Holy Roman Empire. They were sort of busy in a bunch of other places. The Eastern Roman Empire was just busy in a bunch of other places. The Lombards were sort of in decline themselves, and the Muslims were busy fighting themselves. And then the Pope was, popes kind of came and went. Some were more powerful than others. And so there was never really any sort of consolidation of papal authority in the area either. And so it was just this continual hodgepodge that nobody ever sort of really manifested the muscle to conquer until the Normans.
And I guess in this case, who is Tancred de Hauteville? He sends these 12 sons to basically south to sell their swords. Who is he, and why does he take that action?
Well, so he's just as far as we know, just a minor noble in Normandy. He didn't send his sons out per se. What ended up happening is some Normans, allegedly, according to the story, were on a pilgrimage, and they meet a Lombard, sort of an exiled Lombard duke, who basically is like, hey, you guys look like really powerful warriors. We've got lots of fruit. We've got lots of money. There's lots of beautiful ladies here. Why don't you guys come and fight for us? And so the Normans, I think there was about 40 of them in this pilgrimage that they were taking. And they said, all right, well, why don't we head back to Normandy? We'll go get our friends and we'll come back next year, which is what they did. Um, there's sort of a scholarly debate, I suppose, on maybe the exact reason why so many Normans ended up in Italy. Malaterra, who's one of the primary chroniclers, he says his thing is that there was just too many Normans to split up the inheritance, and so you had a lot of these, second, third, fourth, in Tancred's case, 12th sons who weren't really going to get any inheritance in Normandy. And so sort of seeing the opportunities, these are trained warriors. That's sort of the other thing that, maybe we should stipulate is, it's not sort of like me thinking about like, oh, I could just go be a mercenary. The average person like, oh, I'll just go be a mercenary. I mean, these guys had decades of training by the time they're 25, to where like, okay, well, your profession is killing people, and that's how you're going to make your money. And so if there's no real opportunities and, things are kind of stagnating in Normandy, then there's the opportunity to go become a mercenary, in other places. Italy, some of them actually went to Spain, and some of them actually went to the Eastern Roman Empire. And they went sort of all over the place. They were in very high demand because of their exceptional abilities. And that really was also sort of a key to their success, was that they were really the prime warriors of their day. Everything sort of came together with like the Viking audacity and the Frankish methods of war, in addition to sort of the rampant adoption of the stirrup and the high-backed saddle, which allowed the heavy cavalry charge to just be phenomenal on the battlefield, really, for several hundred years. So, they were sort of, it's, I guess, kind of cliche, but there's a certain amount of like right place, right time to the story as well.
It's so interesting too, because on my other channel, The Roman Pattern, where we're kind of, we did the fall of Rome, and now we're looking at kind of the 900 years after that. And it's interesting because this was such an important place that really after Rome falls, it changes hands so many times. And, with the Visigothic kingdom, the Ostrogothic kingdom, the Longobards that come in, so which become the Lombards. And so it is this kind of place that was so important, which now has kind of become a bit of a backwater in a lot of ways. So that this is really an opportunity for the Normans to come in. And I guess when we look at really the first wave of invasion, the first generation of Normans who arrived before Robert Guiscard, I hope I got that one right, is one of the most overlooked stories in medieval history. And this actually wasn't even in my notes, and you said, no, we need to cover this because this is pretty important. So walk us through how they went from being hired sword arms in the 1020s to being more formally recognized by 1053. Rainulf versus Grant, William of Iron's arm raise, and then the Battle of Civitate, I believe is how this is pronounced. It looks like it's a Latin pronunciation. Most viewers probably won't have heard of this, and in my research, I didn't even have it in my notes, and you told me to add it. So how does this all kind of work with kind of establishing this initial Norman foothold? And how does this even, there's a capture of the Pope in 1053 as well. So how does this kind of all set up with the kind of first wave of Normans into Italy?
Yeah, well, so I think you're doing great up until Civitate. I think that's how.
Oh, no.
So the Normans, I believe the first wave of them arrives in 1018, and maybe important. I don't want to maybe go on record as saying that I think the Italian Normans are maybe the most important figures in the period. In terms of historical impact, they're significant, but I find it to just be the most incredible story, and for them to just be incredible characters. One of the things that really sticks out to me, which I'll get into all of your question in just a second, but the thing that really sticks out to me about them is, which was also, I believe, sort of alluded to in John Julius Norwich's book, Normans in the South is what it's called. Excellent book. Is that you really get the sense when you're reading about the Normans that they were just having so much fun. There's, lots of, I've read historical accounts of many other people in many other times and places, like Richard the Lionheart in the Third Crusade. It doesn't seem like he's really having any fun, to be honest. But you get a sense when you're reading about the Normans and their accounts and these different, stories from them, that they're just having an incredible time. And you can kind of, I suppose, take that however you want. But so they arrive in 1018. And I should also add that I think the initial story that went back to Normandy is about when these Norman pilgrims were passing through. They were actually passing through, I forget what village it was, and it was getting raided by some Muslims as they were passing through. And there's only 40 of them or whatever it was. And the local Lombards who were running the village, who were in charge of everything, they weren't really doing anything about it. And so the Normans were all there, and they were like, "Well, we'll just go solve this problem right now." And they just ride down and they kill and drive off all the raiders. And so the story goes back that I forget whether it's the Lombards or the Eastern Romans, but whoever the men are there, they act like women was sort of the thing that goes back. So it was kind of like framed even at the beginning to the Normans in Normandy of like, this is very easy. Like the dudes who are there now are very weak. They're like women. So it's kind of a
I can just imagine
place.
them going back, like, they're going back like, guys, this place, it's easy. You just got to, follow us there. It's going to be a great time.
The women are magnificent, and the men are like women, So,
so they're Greek.
Well, yeah. So
that's how Romans would have felt about them early on. But anyway,
right. So that's anyway. But that's sort of the story that goes back, and so you end up with, I think, it seems. I'm speculating in the Norman mind. There's sort of like this exotic land with a lot of opportunity, and everybody there is really weak. They show up in 1018, and they meet up with this Lombard Duke, and they basically join forces. There's a couple hundred of them, and it sort of becomes the strongest, cleverest guys sort of work their way up into being sort of the guys who are running everything. And so the main guy there is Gilbert. And I should also add another reason from this point on that for the next several decades that Normans ended up there was because exile became a more palatable political consequence rather than putting somebody to death. So like if you killed somebody, rather than the Duke of Normandy killing you, as would have been custom, for something like that, they would just exile you. And so that would sort of stop the person who gets exiled. That would sort of stop their family from having real bad blood with the Duke of Normandy and sort of, these sort of feuding things continuing if you just get exiled. So it was a combination of a lot of these different things. But they show up there. Things go great for like the first year and a half. The Normans are just running over everybody. They're getting rich. They're steamrolling. These sort of Eastern Roman holdouts. They're driving off the Muslims. And then the Eastern Roman Empire shows up with an army, and they meet them at the battlefield, essentially right around Cannae, the very famous site between Hannibal and the Romans. And the empire basically kills them almost down to a man. I think there was,
wow.
It's reported, I think about, maybe about a dozen Normans survived. And one of those was Rainulf, who was Gilbert's brother, who sort of becomes the next sort of head of the Normans, if you will, sort of their unofficial leader. But the Normans just keep coming, the next, every year and sort of throughout the year, these, they're getting increased reinforcements of all of these, second, third, fourth sons who are all trained warriors. And it's very much, and you'll see this just a few decades later, actually, in the Crusades. It's very much a plug and play system. They're very much like trained in this method of warfare where, you don't even have to necessarily grow up with somebody or live with somebody. You show up and everybody knows the drill, like how you ride, how you charge, how you work together, the discipline on the battlefield. So you get these guys that are just coming periodically and they fit right in, and, it's just a well-oiled machine. And so the Normans, as their numbers grow, they become the mercenaries. They're mercenaries, and it becomes where they're mercenaries on both sides of the conflict. They're employed by the Eastern Romans. They're employed by the Lombards. They're employed by the Pope. They're employed by whoever. And so it gets to be the point where there's so many of them, we're talking, 1,000, 2,000, to where they're on both sides of every conflict. Well, when the winner wins, then those Normans would go to their guy and say, hey, why don't you give our friends over here some special terms, which is what they would do. And so basically every conflict, Normans are getting paid on both sides. The losers are getting let off easy on the losing side. The winners are getting extra loot on their side, and they're increasing in manpower and wealth and prestige, with every battle, basically. And it gets to the point where eventually I believe it's Sergius of Naples, in order to sort of secure the loyalty of Rainulf, he grants him the county or the city of Aversa, and is sort of a vassal under him, and he gives him his sister as a wife, to sort of keep his loyalty. And so it becomes to where, and this sort of opened everybody's eyes. Up until this point, they're sort of all just mercenaries having a good time, just fighting and making money and this, that, and the other. But when Rainulf gets territory, sort of as a premium payment, if you will, he gets territory and a wife. That's sort of got the gears turning a little bit in everybody's head that like, well, actually, maybe there's levels here. And that's kind of a unique thing with mercenaries, that's, that you see, you sort of rarely see, I think in history, mercenaries sort of offered actual territory as payment. But everybody there is just sort of in such a dire struggle that, and they're all trying to one up each other and sort of make sure that, Normans are on every side of the conflict. How do you make sure that Rainulf stays on your side? And so with him getting that, and then it sort of escalates to the point where eventually, in subsequent revolt, I believe it's in 1041, the Normans are sort of granted the city of Melfi, as sort of their joint headquarters. Because at that point, there's sort of, you can think of it maybe as tribes, there's sort of groups of Normans, that are sort of under these like family heads or sort of individual rulers. And at times when they all come together, then there's sort of like certain guys that are leaders. But because there's no, at this point, there's no like Duke of Calabria or anything like this, who's a Norman, it's just sort of very much like the top guys are, who's ever is the toughest and whoever's got the biggest war band, if you will. And so when they get Melfi as their headquarters, that sort of kicks off sort of further territorial expansion and leads to William sort of, I believe William is sort of like nominally referred to as like the Count of Apulia or Duke of Apulia, but it's not really until his younger brother Drogo, I believe, is the first one who's sort of like officially invested. Which, yes, a great name. I didn't realize that.
Makes me think of Khal Drogo from Game of Thrones.
That's actually a Carolingian name. I thought it was like a Norman name, but yeah, it's Charlemagne had I believe, a bastard son named Drogo.
So this is interesting, and I guess would you say that the turning, because we talked about it's interesting because I think in some ways it's reminiscent of the decline of the Western Roman Empire and what they're dealing with the Huns, right? Like everybody's using Huns against each other, and then the next thing though they're giving the Huns land, and all of a sudden they're dealing with the Huns are now the powerful one. It's kind of giving someone land and a base of operation kind of takes that nomad or that mercenary and changes how they operate and what they value. So would you say that the turning point of when they go from mercenaries to more of a united force is before Robert Guiscard or after Robert Guiscard? Like, where would we kind of put that line of denotation?
Well, so I should stipulate that I'm not a scholar. I'm just a big enthusiast. So my opinion on this may differ from technical scholarly opinions. But certainly, the Battle of Civitate is a huge unifying event, and I guess I didn't answer what happens there. But so essentially, what happens? The Pope, you have a new Pope, Leo IX. He's a pretty aggressive guy, and he's sort of getting and he's familiar with the Normans. And it should be said at this point that the Normans were, for all accounts, pretty bad rulers. This is it's like a bunch of dudes. They're just hanging out. They're mercenaries. And then all of a sudden they have land. And they're just there to make money. They're not like taking it seriously. And so, they're just raiding. They're raiding each other. They're just raiding everybody. They're trying to make money, whatever. And so there's, they cause famines. They cause peasant revolts. They're not good rulers, yet. And so the Pope's getting these stories. He's familiar with what's going on, and he's sort of getting increasing word of like, hey, my subjects are just subjected to, essentially these terrorists, these Normans that are there that are just taking advantage of everybody, raiding all the time, killing people, whatever. So he sort of makes overtures to the Holy Roman Emperor and says like, hey, why don't we, unite. You guys have had horrible luck dealing with the Normans. We've had terrible luck dealing with the Normans. Our powers combined. Why don't we join our armies and, come up with a final solution to the Norman question, if you will. And so that's what they try to do. But the Normans, they're kind of aware. They become aware of what's going on. And so they gather basically every Norman knight who's in Italy, with the exception of, anybody that just needs to be, you got to keep a couple guys around and maybe keep the city, that you're controlling in line. But basically every Norman warrior is aware that, like, this is sort of our, potentially extinction event here, if they get a big enough army. And it should be said, that's one of the reasons why the Normans were successful. If the Holy Roman Empire, or if the Eastern Roman Empire at any point had just said, hey, we're going to go field an army of 20,000 guys and go crush the Normans, they could have done it. The Normans were fantastic, but you can't beat, 100-to-1 odds or something like this. But that sort of thing just never materialized. And this is kind of one of the reasons why it didn't, is because, when the Pope put together this sort of pseudo ragtag army that he was going to go meet up with the, I'm sure, much better army of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Normans ended up sort of intercepting him at Civitate and, running half of his army off the field right away, and then slaughtering the other half of his army down to a man. And that they essentially took the Pope prisoner. Although, you could think of him as maybe more of a special guest. They certainly respected him, they and the sources sort of, mention, the Normans' respect. And even prior to the battle, the Normans were sending messengers to the Pope saying, hey, we don't want to fight, we're good Christians. We don't want to fight the Pope, come on, man. But, he kind of forced their hand. And so they entertained the Pope for 9 months or so. He was writing letters furiously all over Europe trying to get somebody to help him. But at this point, the Normans' reputation was just so phenomenal. Nobody was coming to help him. And so finally, he officially invested Humphrey as the Duke of Apulia and Duke of Apulia and Calabria, I believe. And so that's where it really finally coalesced under an official, this is the guy, who's sort of, the Norman sovereign in the area. So I'd say that's a pretty pivotal, event in the story, which, that's 1053. So you figure between 1018 and 1053 is, I think, 35 years. So pretty quick, ascent, into becoming a duke, from basically nothing.
So that's really interesting because it's, they basically, these groups unite, they decide they're going to take out the Normans. They have their kind of siege of Acre type moment. And the Normans basically turn the tide, capture the Pope. And now they've taken that power and basically showed that it's a bit hollow in a lot of ways. So from here, I guess, where do we go from here? Robert Guiscard, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, kind of comes into the scene after this around 1059 with, he himself has a pretty incredible story going from a horse thief to somebody that actually has land in a very short period of time. So how do we see this transition then of, we have first these guys that are mercenaries, they're fighting on the other side. The Pope decides he's going to take them out. The Pope shows that that's not really something that can be done. And then the power starts to change a little bit. So how does Robert fit into all of this?
Yeah, so, Robert actually, he commanded one of the 3 Norman divisions at the Battle of Civitate because he was the, I suppose, next in line. His brother Humphrey was sort of the premier leader of the Normans at that time. So you had Humphrey was commanding the center, Robert was on the left, and then you had Richard of Aversa, who was, I believe, the cousin of Rainulf, and ended up taking over sort of his territory in Aversa on the right. So Robert had been there for a little while prior to the Battle of Civitate, but when he arrived, he came, I want to say it's, maybe 5 or 10 years previous. I forget the exact year that he arrived. But when he got there, Drogo was actually the one who was in charge. And, there was no real family favors. He didn't show up and then all of a sudden, Drogo's like, hey, you're my half brother, here, have 50 guys or whatever. He showed up and Drogo just told him hey man, you got to go figure it out. And so that's what he did. He basically just sort of rode off into Calabria and started raiding, started sort of getting some money where he could sort of hire his own guys and sort of have his own band around him. And by all accounts, he was, nearly starving at points, starving to death. And just, there's all kinds of stories of him, kidnapping people and, a city closes its walls when he shows up. So they stage a fake funeral where all the swords are in a casket and they're all dressed up in these robes, and they get into the gate with the casket, and yoink, it's all swords. And, then they go around chopping people up and taking treasure and stuff. And, there's another story. One that I really love is, he's terrorizing this, I forget the name of the city. But the Eastern Roman Empire has a governor there. His name's Peter. And so this guy, Peter, ends up sending a message to Robert Guiscard, hey, we got to stop all this banditry, and Robert says like, well, hey, why don't we have a meeting, in the woods outside the city or whatever to discuss terms. So they show up, and Robert's got, his whatever, his retinue with him, and Peter's got all of his guards and all his guys with him, and Robert just rides up alone. And so Peter, sort of wanting to, show that he's just as tough, he rides up alone. And there's some sort of salute that like you sort of like lean out of your saddle a little bit to like salute the other guy. So Robert does the salute. And when the governor does this salute, Robert grabs him by the throat, by his collar, and yanks him out of the saddle, and then just rides off into the woods and ends up ransoming him back to the city. So just stuff like, there's all these kind of crazy stories about how he's making money and trying to afford guys, and he works his way up to having his own, sort of tribe or war band or however you want to refer to them, and becomes sort of a main player in Civitate. And then when Humphrey dies, Humphrey has a couple kids. We don't really hear what happens to them. I mean, of course, people, are going to speculate that Robert did something. I have no idea. We don't really know what happens, but is very much a meritocratic thing to begin with. At this point, you wouldn't really expect, there's no child rulers in this situation. I mean, it's a very volatile situation and stuff like that. So
it seems you have to have the kind of physical and military strength to even be able to hold your position.
Right. Yeah. This is not like an established sovereign, dynastic thing or whatever. I mean, this is very much still the Wild West. So, Robert kind of taking over, I think, is a very natural thing. Whether or not, I guess we want to say that he did something to kids or not, we don't have any information on that. So we can only speculate. But anyway, so Robert takes over as Duke of Apulia, and then Roger shows up shortly before that. And starts to sort of make his own way, kind of similar to the way that Robert had to. And they end up becoming essentially like partners, and Roger becomes really his like right-hand man. So Robert sort of focuses his efforts on really essentially kicking the Eastern Roman Empire out of Italy. And Roger's focus is on essentially at first sort of taking the rest of Calabria, which is the very southwest portion of the peninsula, and then he ends up moving into Sicily. And they make an arrangement because Robert is technically the sovereign, but Robert makes an arrangement with him. This is also like another funny story. They make an arrangement, sort of an unofficial arrangement, where Robert says, like, hey, Roger, here's what we'll do. Whatever territory, I'll kind of help you out a little bit, but whatever territory you take, we'll just split it. Okay. So we'll split, and it's sort of an unofficial arrangement. You don't really know, like, who's got what. Roger's just sort of busy taking all this stuff and sort of increasing his, status and all this stuff. This woman from Normandy, who he was in love with as a younger man, ends up coming to Sicily or to Italy while he's busy invading Sicily, and he sort of falls in love with her. They get married immediately, and because of this, Roger needs to prove his status. So I believe it's called like the Morgan Gab, which is where he sort of endows his bride's family with some land and to show his status and stuff like this. So he needs some land and treasure to display his status. And in Normandy, he was the 12th son of this very minor noble. So he had nothing. So there was real like no marriage prospects or anything like that for him when he knew her previously. But now he's arguably the second most powerful man in southern Italy. So he's, her family's enthusiasm for the marriage has increased, I suppose you could say. So they're immediately married, and Roger needs some stuff to give her family to, display his status. So he basically writes, he sends to Robert, like, hey, I need some stuff. And Robert's just like, yeah, whatever, like, we've got an arrangement. So Roger writes him another letter that says, we got to figure out who owns what. And if you don't tell me what part of this is mine, then I'm going to enforce what part is mine with my sword arm in 30 days. And so Robert gets this letter, and he just immediately gets all his guys up, and he rides and besieges the castle that Roger's in. And they have this like scrap where Roger's running through the woods and Robert's trying to get him. And then Roger goes to a city, and so that's friendly to him. And then Robert shows up with sort of his guys on the way outside, and and then he goes in disguise into the city, but somebody recognizes him, and then the townsfolk are all up in arms, and they kill the hosts. And I mean, it's this huge thing where Robert gets captured. And in the end, the city, all the rulers of the city have Robert captured, and they send to Roger like, hey, we got your brother, should we kill him? What should we do? And Roger shows up, and he's just like, you should have told me the second that you got him. Like, what's wrong with you? And he walks up to Robert, and then they just have like this, it's like, they just start hugging and crying, and apparently just like a very like biblical brotherly reunion. And Robert is like, I'm so sorry, we'll divide it up. Here's the territory, whatever. And so it sort of resolves that way. But it was, 1 minute they're fighting each other, and then the next minute, it's this sort of crazy reunion, and then they figure it out, I guess.
So I guess in what point in this do they have full possession of Sicily? And I guess there's also a plan from Robert to actually take Constantinople. Does he actually act on that, or kind of where do those plans go?
Yeah, so Roger ends up taking Sicily. It takes him about 30 years, and large part is really just because of manpower. And I guess every year up until 1066, there's probably hundreds, 200, 300, 400 young aspiring Norman warriors who are coming to Sicily or to Italy, so their numbers are being reinforced every year. But when William the Conqueror invades England, all of a sudden there's all kinds of new opportunities right across the English Channel. And so it seems to me, I haven't actually seen anybody really talk about this, but it seems to me that Norman immigration, if you will, to Italy basically stops after 1066. So at that point, you're kind of, your source of manpower is sort of dried up. And so Roger is really sort of, as the second in command, is the one who feels this the most, because of course all of, any reinforcements or any of this sort of stuff, Robert is the one who's really in control of all of that. So for Roger to take Sicily, it's really just a long grind. He takes a city here, a couple years later, they kind of work up to where that's defensible. He goes and takes another city, works up a couple years, and he's doing it all with a very, very small amount of men, which is why it takes so long. Whereas Robert, he, as the official Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and technically Sicily, he's got more control over manpower. And so as he's sort of consolidating all of his gains, he is able to start fielding larger armies, which is how he does end up invading Greece, and theoretically coming after Constantinople. It's sort of it's another, he's an audacious guy, it's just another, he ends up, what happened is, as sort of as recognition of the Normans, the emperor at the time, I forget who it was, basically, granted Robert Guiscard some imperial titles for him and his men. And part of the arrangement was that Robert's daughter Olympias would go to Constantinople and be engaged to the future emperor. I forget what his name was, because he never became emperor. And so his daughter ended up, in a monastery or whatever it is, basically she got dispossessed of her technical end of the arrangement. So Robert ends up meeting some guy, or some guy comes to Robert or something, who claims to be some other dispossessed emperor. And so Robert uses that as pretext of like, oh, we're going to put the rightful emperor on the throne. And he does raise an army and invade, and things go well for them at the beginning. But Alexios is a totally different type of guy than the Normans are used to fighting. He's a very, very clever guy. So they win a few battles. But Alexios, he starts paying the Holy Roman Emperor to come invade southern Italy. He starts paying these different other people to revolt and do all these things, and cause the Normans tons of problems back home, which essentially handicaps Robert's invasion.
So I guess when we look at Robert, we were talking about 1066 a bit, and it's interesting as well. I would recommend people go back and check out the other Norman episode we did as well, because it's kind of interesting how basically William the Conqueror starts to replace a lot of the ruling class in England, and does it very quickly. But I guess looking at Guiscard and also William, they were contemporaries in a lot of ways, if I'm correct. And it seems that, there would be cases that, maybe William was jealous of Guiscard, and I guess when we look at this, how do the two men compare? And was there any, I guess, feelings between them in a lot of ways? You're muted, Michael.
I'm sorry. I think it's fair to say that I don't think Robert Guiscard probably thought about William the Conqueror very much. But this comes from William of Malmesbury, who wrote about 40 years after, or I think he wrote 30 years after William the Conqueror's death. And I pulled this up so I could read it to you. He wrote about William saying, "But he, with his usual magnanimity, not regarding the expense, had engaged even Hugo the Great, brother of the King of France, with bands to serve in his army. He was accustomed to stimulate and incite his own valor. By the remembrance of Robert Guiscard, saying it was disgraceful to yield in courage to him who he surpassed in rank. For Robert, born of middling parentage in Normandy, that is, neither very low nor very high, had gone, a few years before William's arrival in England, with 15 knights into Apulia, to remedy the narrowness of his own circumstances by entering into the service of that inactive race of people." So, you get this, William of Malmesbury is saying, that William the Conqueror sort of, got himself psyched up, by thinking of Robert Guiscard, like, I'm not going to let that guy get the better of me.
I'm way better than that guy. I've got the right parentage. Like, he just like rolls into Italy with 15 guys, and next thing you know, he's taking over the place.
If he can do that with 15 guys, you should see what I can do with 14. It's like that meme in the mirror, you can.
So I guess from that perspective, then, being somebody that studies the Normans like you do, which one do you think is kind of the bigger person?
Well, it's hard to argue with the historical impact of William the Conqueror. I can't really argue with that. In my opinion, Robert Guiscard is just a phenomenal figure. I'm kind of personally underwhelmed by William the Conqueror, in light of comparison with many other Normans. And people will disagree with that. That's fine. But, I just find the story of these guys going to Italy and basically, like you said, going from horse thieves to creating a kingdom, that lasts for centuries. It's just an incredible story. It's very unlike really almost any other story in the medieval period, almost unlike any other story in history. And, there is a certain amount of right place and right time, but there is also a certain amount of sort of just the martial excellence of the Normans, which we see later, like during the First Crusade, for example. So it was it's not like an accident, that the Normans were so good. I mean, they were great. They became famous mercenaries, in Spain, in the Eastern Roman Empire, all over the place. And I just, for me, I mean, it's hard to top just the incredible story, which we've kind of just barely touched on here,
sure,
of the Italian Normans.
So I guess looking at it then, why does the English language or English history and English speaking history in general remember William so much, right? Like, it's a name that people seem to know even if they have no real relevance of history, but Guiscard seems to be forgotten in a lot of ways. I guess, why is that?
I think we place an overemphasis on this abstract idea of historical importance. the idea that like if you influence something in history, like you invented the wheel or you conquered England, which, set it on this completely different trajectory away from its previous Anglo-Saxon trajectory. We sort of look at, I think we overvalue historical importance, and we undervalue maybe some things that previous, like the medievals, for example, would have valued more about history, so like the aspirational quality in a way of like seeing somebody accomplish something great. Now, whether that, the historical importance, whether or not that's kind of irrelevant. But sort of these great deeds, they viewed history as in a way as like aspirational, as like retelling these great deeds as a way to, kind of in a way as William getting himself, hyped up thinking about Robert Guiscard, like me getting hyped up thinking about Robert Guiscard, like they kind of viewed it in that way too. They would have, whatever tapestries of these events and things. So that way they could, get themselves pumped up about what their ancestors did. And so, but I think, we've kind of reduced a lot of our historical study down to quote unquote historical importance, as opposed to maybe a little bit more of a personal story in the way that, ties you to a tradition and gets you, aspiring to similar or greater things.
So I guess going a little bit further down the road, after Roger and after Robert, we have Roger II, who basically unifies everything in the Kingdom of Sicily around 1130. And he also builds what's arguably the most sophisticated state in medieval Europe. We have Muslim scholars in administration, Byzantine bureaucrats in the treasury, Latin monks in the chancery. So give us a picture of Palermo under Roger II. And was this genuine tolerance or just ruthless pragmatism?
Yeah, I mean, well, kind of like I alluded to earlier, after 1066, I think the Italian Normans are facing a real manpower problem. Because they took over Italy with maybe in total by the time, in 1081, when Robert sort of secures the peninsula, I mean, I'm just estimating maybe they have 5,000 men. That's a really small amount of guys to hold, maintain, have armies, that sort of stuff. I mean, it's just a very, very small number. So yeah, Roger, I mean, he does unify everything because, everything is split between Roger and Robert, and then their kids end up having some, Robert's kids end up having some succession disputes, which Roger ends up sort of settling, but then his son Roger ends up sort of unifying everything under him. And I would say, I think to me, it just reads more as pragmatism. I don't know if, ruthless maybe, but there is a certain political reality to, if you only have 5,000 guys.
Well, who's the best I can get to get each one of these jobs done and get them done in the right way?
Right.
I have a middling number of Normans, and these things need to happen.
Well, also you're ruling these foreign populations, and one of the ways to relate, I suppose, to the population is to appoint some of their guys to positions of authority where they can do things, and then they can sort of keep their own people in line, as it were. And there was sort of prior to these types of things, once Roger had taken Sicily, I forget, I think it was like the Venetians or the Pisans, I forget who it was. Somebody came to him with an offer that was like, hey, we're going to go attack this Muslim city. Why don't you get your guys and come with us and, help us out? And Roger declined because at that point he's ruling over kind of a decent sized Muslim population. So him going around attacking Muslim cities with, sort of very few guys of his own, it creates like political tension. So I think, maybe ruthless pragmatism is fair. But there's just a certain political reality to when you don't have a lot of guys and you're governing these larger populations of other people, you sort of need their political input, if you will, or for them to have some sort of, political pressure valve release.
Well, I guess from there we get to one of my favorite names in history to say, and that is Hohenstaufen. Hohenstaufen, which is great name. But you've actually argued that Frederick II is more Hauteville than Hohenstaufen. And so I guess let's make that case, but also let's step back and take a look at Norman blood essentially ends with Frederick in 1250. but the political architecture of the Hautevilles really does stick around for a bit. And I guess, what does that look like? So let's take a look at that.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's raised in Palermo. He obviously speaks a whole bunch of different languages, and he becomes first king of Sicily before he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. Even once he becomes Holy Roman Emperor, he spends basically most of his time in Palermo. He doesn't spend hardly any time in Germany doing stuff, which I'm not going to get into that. Sorry. So,
well, I'll just say, first of all, too, this is an incredible turn of events, by the way, that we now have a Holy Roman Emperor in this line when, just under 200 years ago at this point, the Holy Roman Emperor was trying to remove the Normans.
That's right. Yeah. So, and it worked out that, his mother, which was the daughter of Roger II, she ended up marrying, I forget which emperor it was, Henry IV. I can't remember which one it was. But ended up having him. And then his father died when he was very young, just 4 years old. So she basically held the kingdom of Sicily in regency for him until he was, I believe, 14 when he was crowned king. And then it was, I believe, about a decade later that he became Holy Roman Emperor. And so the political architecture did sort of last. I mean, the kingdom of Sicily it didn't really just get any rivals that wanted to completely obliterate it, or it was, too strong, to where it made more sense to just keep, stay friends with them, stay sort of allies, control the kingdom. And I think it's kind of a similar thing, when the Normans, just as we were talking about, the Normans are there. And so they're sort of bringing in, all of these, Eastern Roman scholars or, Arabic governors or these other types of things. It's kind of similar when other people arrive, where they sort of keep this architecture, like this is sort of all working, and you have sort of all of these different populations. I mean, it would be a huge, manpower requirement to go and take something over, very similar to what William the Conqueror did with England when he brought over, thousands of Normans and replaced most of the aristocracy in England in order to control the country. You would need sort of that sort of event. So when you end up with sort of these other, like the Angevins coming in, or they're not coming in with the sort of manpower to really take everything over. And so it's just much more convenient to keep things in place and, collect your fees at the top, essentially.
Very cool. Well, Michael, I recommend that people definitely check out your Substack, your podcast, and a lot of what's out there. But, people can get kind of a fuller view of this argument, because we've kind of tried to just do an overview in about 50 minutes here. But I guess, where can people find you? Where can they connect with you? And where can they support you?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure. I love talking about the Italian Normans. I tried to stay on topic, so I did my best. I get stuck in the little stories and stuff because the
stories
so
are the fun part, man. That's where the humanity is.
Yeah, they're so exciting. But yeah, you can find me. I'm on X at Memory Medieval. I'm also on Substack, and the publication, if you'd like to read more creative history, creative essays on history, that's at feignedflight.com or Feigned Flight on Substack. And if you're a writer and you want to write for us, we do pay for essays. So if you want to write something creative, we'd be happy to have you write for us as well. So on X, on Substack, and also if you want to learn more about the Normans, I got to shout out. I believe we had David on for the William the Conqueror episode. We collaborated for a giant 4.5-hour documentary on the Normans. I wrote the second and fourth parts on the Italian Normans and the crusading Normans, and then he covered the early Normans and William the Conqueror. 4.5 hours. I believe it's the internet's biggest documentary on the Normans.
Wow.
And his channel is Empire Builders, so you can find it there.
So we'll link up the 1066 episode we did in the description here. We'll also link that episode as well. Also, if you got a lot of free time, David did a 12-hour reading of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire before YouTube said you can have no more time. So, Michael, thanks for hanging out with me today, man. It
was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Here's what stays with you after everything Memory Medieval just walked us through. The English-speaking world remembers William the Conqueror as the Norman conqueror because English history was written in English, taught in English, and mythologized in English. William's story became the standard because his descendants ended up on the throne that eventually became the British Empire. And empires get to write the textbooks. The Hautevilles achieved more, held territory longer, and built a more sophisticated state than anything William ever managed. But their story was told in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and eventually Italian and French. When historical narrative got standardized in the English-speaking classrooms, the Hautevilles fell out of it. That's the first pattern worth naming. The historical figures we call important are usually the ones whose stories survived in the languages that later became academically dominant, not the ones who actually mattered the most. The second pattern is the mechanism itself. The Hautevilles didn't invade southern Italy. They were invited in. Byzantine themes needed mercenaries. Lombard princes needed enforcers. Popes needed protection. Every fragmented power in the region hired the Normans to solve a problem. And the Normans slowly became the answer to every problem. Then, they became the region's ruler. That template, insert yourself as an essential service to a fragmented power structure, make yourself impossible to remove, because the authority you were hired to defend against is a repeatable formula, not a medieval accident. Private military contractors have run it. Financial firms have run it. Technology platforms are running on it right now. The last observation is about what lasts. William's Norman house ended in 3 generations. The Hauteville political inheritance ran for 725 years. What lasted wasn't the family. It was the state architecture, a multicultural administrative apparatus built on absorbing every competent tradition it encountered, rather than displacing them. Roger II's Palermo enjoyed Muslim scholars, Byzantine bureaucrats, and Latin monks in the same government, because he needed all 3 to hold what he had conquered. The institutions that outlived their founders are the ones that stopped being about the founder. Robert Guiscard was jealous of nothing. William the Conqueror was jealous of him. History remembers the wrong Norman. Same playbook, different century. This has been Hidden Forces in History. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you want more Hidden Forces in History.